Yes, once again, we have liftoff. I want to thank you for tuning into this episode of the Big Truth Podcast, and I'm stoked to have my man Tim Weisberg with us today. And if you don't know Tim, then you don't really follow anything in the paranormal world because he's left a stamp on all kinds of things in the paranormal world. He's an author, a radio personality, a producer, a TV personality, a lecturer on the circuit. He's here in this area, so he does a lot with the Bridgewater Triangle and stuff in New England, but all over the place. But I want to formally thank Tim for joining us today. What's going on, man?
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and happy to talk about weird stuff.
Yeah. And for those that were in the area, you got to see Tim give a lecture over at the Dipper, and that was awesome. And we definitely want to do more. And I think we learned a little bit from this. Next time, I'll rent a bunch of folding chairs, and we'll definitely get the PA in, because that was a well attended event, and it was funny. I don't know if you saw any of the feedback afterwards, but everyone was stoked, but a couple people were mad because there wasn't enough chairs and this and that. And I'm like, dude, it's a bar. It's not a theater, But
and we kind of expected there to be a few people that would show up. And then as that Facebook event kept growing, I'm like, there's no way 500 people are possibly going to show up.
Yeah.
Maybe like 10 or 20, but it was more than that.
Oh yeah, no, it was a good one, man. Definitely stoked to do that again next time. And if you are in the New England area, keep an eye out, and we will post that up when we do another one. Pizza and paranormal. Tim coined that phrase, and it's perfect. But yeah,
so pizza. So
yeah, appreciate it, man. So Tim's done, you've done multiple radio shows dealing with paranormal stuff, whether it's Spooky South Coast or you took over Art Bell's, what was it, Midnight in the Desert or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
How was it? And we'll get into all that stuff. And Midnight Society, you've been on a bunch of TV shows and documentaries, you've authored books. Before we get into everything you've done, why don't we just especially for listeners or viewers who know you or don't know you, why don't you talk a little bit about your background and how you even found your way into getting into the paranormal topics, or like what got you interested in the paranormal, and then not only what got you interested, but what got you actively like researching it and participating in that world?
Like most people that get involved in the paranormal, I started off in it because I had experiences. So when I was a kid, really little, I remember like seeing the old hag on the wall, the shadow of a woman with claws kind of on the wall. And all right, she's coming to get me. And all kinds of different weird stuff that would happen, strange dreams and things like that. I had instances not of missing time, but where I woke up in places where I shouldn't have been. And where one time we were camping and I woke up and my parents were gone. And I left the tent looking for them and found some people. And I said, I'm looking for my mom and dad. Are they here? And they said, no, let's bring you back to where you belong. And they brought me back to my tent. And they were my mom and dad sleeping in their sleeping bags the whole time. Weird things like that, which my parents still to this day say never happened. But I know they did.
Yeah.
But those kind of things.
How old were you when those things were happening? What was the age?
I would say 5 years old, 4, 5, 6 years old. I remember this stuff going on.
Okay.
And then fast forward about, 5 or 6 years later, my aunt and uncle bought a haunted house right in the heart of the Bridgewater Triangle in Halifax, Massachusetts. And at first, they didn't really talk about the experiences that were going on there. So when I went over there to stay and spend a week or two in the summertime, it was kind of a bit of a surprise. And I didn't really know how to process it. But then once everybody started talking about it and they discussed the fact that they had a ghost, well, that kind of opened the door up for me then to say, all right, well, I'm going to go to the library and get books out about this. And, when I was a kid, they had those Time Life Mysteries of the Unknown commercials on TV. So I would always try to read those books if I saw somebody had one at their house. But it was, realizing that there was a whole section in my public library that dealt with this topic that really got me diving into it. Then it kind of fell by the wayside for a long time until, because you just become an adult and you got more important things to worry about. And I also spent time becoming a sports writer with the Standard Times, which happened completely by accident. I was huge into pro wrestling. And, this is in 1998 when it really started to come back again. And there was a wrestling column in the local newspaper, the Standard Times. And I would get upset because some weeks it wouldn't run. And so I said to them, listen, I'll write this column for you every week. I'll write it for free. And eventually they brought me on and they had me do that. And that kind of led the door to me becoming a sports writer and covering high school sports and the Celtics and the Patriots. And it also led to me doing a spot on WBSM Sports Show every week. And one day the program director said to me, we really like what you do. If you'd like to come and do your own show, we'd love to have you. And, what would you like to talk about? And by this time, this was 2005, late 2005. And by this time, about a year before, Ghost Hunters had premiered on television. And so that got me back into the paranormal world again. And so I said, I'd really like to do a show about the paranormal because I'm trying to learn more about it. And I'd love to have guests on that can talk about it. And this is kind of like my way of getting to talk to all of the people that are the big names in the field when normally, they wouldn't pick up the phone if I called them. But if I say, hey, I'm going to put you on the radio, then, at this time, podcasts were like a new thing. So I didn't even think about podcasting until my producer, Matt Costa, brought it up. But it turned into, this huge thing. And then from there, it just kept snowballing. We were one of the first paranormal podcasts out there on the internet. We're the only radio shows talking about it. And that just grew our audience right from the beginning. 2006, we did our first show, January 26, 2006, and we haven't looked back.
Nice. So going back to just your experiences when you were a kid, because there's a few crazy ones. The shadow person, was that a recurring thing, or was that like a one-time thing, like the shadow hag thing that you saw?
That I saw sleeping at my grandmother's house. Every Friday night, my grandparents would take me for the night so that my parents could go out and have a date night. This is when, I was born when they were 20 years old. So they were still kids. They still wanted to go out and have fun and have a night where they could do stuff. And, for them, it meant like going bowling or going to the movies or whatever. So I would just sleep at my grandmother's house. And it was great for me because I got to watch the Dukes of Hazzard. And then I woke up in the morning and could watch Saturday morning cartoons. But at night, when I was
Creature double feature? You watch Creature double feature or 56? Oh, there you go.
Feature. Oh, yeah. So when I was sleeping over her house in the spot that I slept on, the wall there would have this shadow that would show up. And they lived on a busy road in Randolph, Massachusetts. There were cars always going by. So that creates that headlight effect of it coming across the room. But this shadow seemed to not be, even at 5 years old, I knew it was weird that this shadow wasn't there when the lights came by. It was there when it was in total darkness. And so I just started to think that there was something more to it. And then years later, when I heard about the old hag syndrome, like that connection just fired off in my brain that that's what I saw. And it never really hurt me. It never really did anything to me, but it would happen pretty much every time I slept over there. And come to find out, that house was haunted. My aunt and my mother grew up in that house. My uncle and my aunts and my mother all talk about the ghost that lived in the attic where the girls' room was.
Crazy. And the camping incident, by any chance were you in a national park when that happened? Because did you ever see Missing 411?
Yes, David Paulides stuff. Yeah, no, I was actually in the Saco River campground in North Conway, New Hampshire, where we used to go and camp every summer when I was little. I woke up. It was dark out. I don't know what time it was. Again, I was right around the same age, 5 years old, and when I woke up, I looked over to my parents because I had to use the bathroom, and I wanted one of them to take me because you had to walk out to the little house with the toilets in it, and they weren't there. And so I went outside looking for them in the screen house. They weren't there. I started walking around, and then I saw some people playing cards over by a campfire, and I thought maybe they're over there playing cards. So I went over there and I said, "Are my mom and dad here?" And they said, "No, let's bring you back to where you belong." And when I went back, they were in the tent, but I told my parents, years later, "You weren't there." And they said, "We were there the whole time." I said, "Come on, tell me the truth. Did you sneak off to go smoke a joint or something? We were out doing something in the woods that you didn't want me to know about?" And because my siblings were there, I think I had two siblings by that point, two of the eventual four. And so they were there, but my parents weren't. And they said, no, that we never left the tent. You just must have not seen us or something. And around that same time, I remember waking up when I was home. I remember waking up in another neighborhood a couple of blocks away. And I didn't know where I was. I just all of a sudden was there. And I remember going and knocking on somebody's door, and I only could remember my grandfather's phone number. So they called my grandfather. He came and got me, brought me home. My parents swear to this day that never happened. And I distinctly remember them having to install locks on the door because they thought that that's how I got out of the house. They put locks up where I couldn't reach.
Oh yeah. Did they think you were like sleepwalking or something?
No, they said that they never put the locks on the door. But I
Oh,
remember, I'm like, what's going on here? I could never figure that out. And when I talked to my co-host Matt Moniz about it, who's a ufologist and an abductee, he's like, do you want me to tell you what really happened? And I was like, no, I don't want to know about that. Because at the same time, I had these dreams where I would be in my room, and I hated sleeping in my room. My parents would put me in there every night. By the time they went to bed, I would sneak out and I would crawl into bed with them. I could not be in my room. It creeped me out. During the day, I was fine, but at night, it creeped me out.
Hmm.
And in my dream, in my room, there was a ramp that went down to my bedroom in the dream. And in the dream, I knew that if I stepped on a certain board, it would creak. And there was a sarcophagus next to the door in my dream. And if I stepped on that board, I knew the sarcophagus would fly open and the mummy would get me. And so in my dream, this happened. And I stepped on the board and it creaked. The sarcophagus opens. The mummy reaches out and grabs me. I grab the bandage and I start pulling on it. And it unwraps. And it's Bo Duke from the Dukes of Hazzard. And he's like, hey, Tim, it was just me all along. I wanted to hang out with you and be friends and hang out. We can go right in the General Lee. And I was like, oh, okay. He's like, yeah, come with me to the General Lee. And something in my brain said, don't go with him. And I don't know what happened. I must have woken up or something. And then, of course, if you do UFO research, alien abduction research, you realize that a lot of times they come to you and they disguise themselves as these like pop culture figures. It's like all of a sudden I was in my bedroom and Mickey Mouse showed up.
Yeah, I heard this something similar, and it was like Fred Flintstone or something. Just that's wild. Yeah.
You just made me make another connection in my head that freaked me out. Something that I never put two and two together. When I was little, maybe about a year before this happened, my mother gave me Flintstones vitamins, and I took those vitamins. And when I looked outside my window, I could see the Incredible Hulk. Like Lou Ferrigno, the Incredible Hulk was outside my house. And I told my mom, like, the Incredible Hulk's outside. I want to go see him. And she's like, no, he's not out there. Like, that was my favorite show at the time. I was like, no, I want to go meet the Incredible Hulk. She's like, there's no Incredible Hulk out there. Yeah. And she thought that the Flintstone vitamins made me hallucinate, so she never gave me vitamins again. But maybe that was an alien appearing on the Incredible Hulk.
That's crazy. Yeah. Yeah. I wonder what that is. Cause I've heard about that from several people that have, not on mine, but on other shows where people said that they come as like weird, like cartoons, like living cartoons. Like I know Bo Duke's different, but like I heard the Mickey Mouse, I heard Fred Flintstone, just things like that. That's such a bizarre, it's like they're trying to take on a familiar form, but they're taking on the form of something that's like fantasy, like a cartoon. Like it's like, do they not?
It's something you can. So I think it's something you can relate to. So I've got a theory about
even though if I was a kid and Fred Flintstone came at me, I'd be like, yo, what the fuck? Like, you know what I mean? Like I could relate to it, but I'm like, but if Bo Duke came or was like, hey, what's up? Let's hang out. I was like, oh, all right, cool. Cause it's a human, but like, it's weird that they took a non-human form trying to relate to children, like, but I guess when you're 5, like, yeah, cartoon you'd probably be more stoked. Like, I guess I'm thinking about it more through an adult lens,
I don't think that aliens are space creatures from another planet. So my theory of what they are kind of jives with why this would happen. I think, and Moniz and I fight about this all the time, because he's somebody who has been abducted, has been on the ship, and he's been researching this and working with abductees for 30 years. So he really, will debate me on this topic. But I think that what happens is these are just modern day boogeymen, modern day fairies, modern day, all these creatures that we used to see and encounter in this realm for centuries. They always came in whatever form would scare us. So, and sometimes that might be the fairies, sometimes it might be trolls or ogres, sometimes that might be something that's a little bit more technologically advanced. And what do we have to be afraid of? We don't believe in all this other stuff. We don't believe in the idea of trolls or fairies. So what are they going to be for us? So for us, the only thing that's left is that technological boogeyman, something that has a technology that we can't comprehend yet. So I think that whatever these things are, they're actually of Earth. They live alongside of us, and they just manifest in different ways.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of, it's, because it seems like, I don't know how to explain it, but the thinking behind uh UFO and alien stuff has like advanced, like because there's it's been studied now for decades, right? So there's a lot of people that think it's something more interdimensional. Um, and then the theory you have is also a very interesting one, and then there's some people that are like, yeah, no, they're from Planet X, you know what I mean, like Anunnaki or something, but yeah, it's an interesting thing. Like, what makes you think that, like, based on the research you've done, what leads you more in that direction to think that they're just kind of like creatures that have lived alongside us throughout time? Like, and do you think they're of this dimension, or do you think they go from, like, they come in and out of this world, or do you think they're always here?
No, I think that they can move through dimensions. They can move through planes of existence. They might be something that is actually, right next to us, but we can't see them in the light spectrum, and they come into the light spectrum so that we can, so they can manifest for us. I don't know, but
Yeah.
I just look at all of these cases, and there's very few people that I've talked with that have compelling stories of actually going to other planets. I mean, you've got your Tony Rodriguez, you've got people like that, people who can describe being somewhere else, but that's, most people just describe being on the ship.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if that's the case, the ship could be anywhere. The ship could be, a warehouse in, Rhode Island. But it just has to be, for me, I need a little bit more compelling evidence to know that it's been something from another planet. Whereas, like, Moniz will tell me, well, I've done testing on, like, Betty Hill's dress and soil samples from the Bentwaters case, and I find elements that are not from this earth. And I'm like, well, but just because they're not from this earth doesn't mean that they're not from this planet in another dimension. So
Yeah.
it's all in, where you're willing to go with that. I think, that it's entirely possible that it's all, I don't want to say a hoax, but it's all part of the illusion of what they're trying to create. So yeah, you've got this element that's not from this earth because they just conjured it up. It doesn't mean that it came from another planet somewhere else.
Sure. Yeah. And with that, I mean, what are you thinking, when people, like, I know there's a lot of research, or a lot of, like, people are interested in, like, the what do they call the USO, the unidentified submergible objects, like, like, are you someone that thinks that have you done much research into, like, the underwater type things, or like the feasibility of underwater bases, or things that we don't know about, with the UFO phenomenon? I think there's a lot of people now looking at it more from an oceanic perspective. Um,
And
have you looked into that much, and what are your thoughts on that?
I have a bit, and I've had the opportunity to meet the gentleman who had the experience at Shag Harbor. He came to this event that was in Massachusetts years and years ago, and shared his story. And I said, this is very compelling. And some of these other stories that I've heard are very compelling. And we don't really know everything that's out there in the ocean. So there could be physical objects that are out there in the ocean. But by the same token, if these things are interdimensional, that could also just be the place where they're, emerging from when they emerge here. And that could be targeted, or that could be accidental.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and that makes sense. What I just spitballing, like, because I know you're versed on a lot of things, and what's your view on, or what's your thoughts, or where's your research lead, if you've looked into this, like, on what's going on in Antarctica, and what they're not wanting us to see out there?
So I had a guy on when I was doing the Midnight Society show. He has, his research data, whatever you want to call it, that there actually is a base out there that was created by the Nazis, and that it was utilized in conjunction with an alien race. That they were in contact with the Nazi regime, and they had this agreement of sharing this base. That the aliens taught them how to build it, and all that kind of stuff. And you start to hear some of these stories, and you're like, well, that's very interesting. And that the Nazis were into the occult, and they were into things like that. So you're like, okay, my mind can go here. I can believe this. But then that person starts bringing up, white supremacist stuff. And then you're like, oh, hold on. Like, now we went somewhere else. Yeah. And that's when I kind of made that break of researching that kind of stuff anymore, because I realized that there's a lot of anti-Semitism and neo-Nazi propaganda that's embedded in a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, which is
But
weird. Yeah, which is weird. It's like, all right, like, don't put ideology into like research. You know what I mean? It's like
right.
we're trying to look at this from a just a general perspective. We're not trying to put an ideological slant on it.
But that's part of the reason why we stopped doing Midnight Societies, because it's getting so hard to vet, 5 guests every week to be able to know if they were going to be that kind of person. We had so many issues over the years with, I mean, I had to cancel a guest just moments before he was supposed to go live with me on the air because the website that he worked with just a few hours before had posted a bunch of really obnoxious, transphobic and homophobic stuff. And I was like, we're not doing this. And he's like,
Yeah.
but that's not me. And I was like, but you work for them and I can't give a platform to those kind of words. So anyway, but I digress. The the stuff that I looked into when it came to that was very, very interesting. And if there was a physical place, a physical base on there, that would be the one place on Earth that I would believe that you could hide something that we wouldn't be able to find it. Because something in the ocean, there's people out there searching all the time for stuff in the ocean. We have satellites now that can see everything right down the bottom of the ocean floor. I mean, it's crazy the technology that we have now. But that's the one place that I think something could be hidden and could be covered up.
Yeah, and there's also thoughts that there might be a pyramid there, or I've heard the base stuff. I'm just wondering like what the reason would still be, because like I don't know if there's truth to this rumor or not, because here's the problem in this paranormal world is it's such a big world of research and people contributing. Some people do things more scientifically or more research based. Some people just kind of might be more prone to fantasy. But is there truth to like allegedly there's like no fly zones in Antarctica, and there's like parts like if you try and go in Google Maps and stuff, it won't show that stuff. Like so that's what always makes things more interesting is like if that's real. And I haven't personally tried to go on Google Maps and look up coordinates or anything. But I don't know if there's any truth to those things, but it's just always the world's way more interesting than I think we think it is. And I don't know. I think half of the fun of paranormal is wondering what's out there. I think if we got the answers, sometimes it would be kind of like, that's all right, cool. But it's more fun to ponder everything and be like, hey, man, like, I don't know.
I've made that same point many times over the years that it's the paranormal isn't just about getting the answers, and for me, it's not about finding the answers. I mean, would I like to know the truth? Of course, but for me, it's more about learning how to get to the truth, learning the right questions to ask, knowing what direction you can go in with research, not being afraid to say everything that I thought that I knew was wrong because now this is taking me in this direction. So for me, it's been more about asking those questions and learning the right questions to ask and having the right conversations with the right people.
Yeah. So something you kind of touched on, and I think is super interesting. Like you've done numerous paranormal shows, and you talked about having to vet guests, and you were doing things where you were having multiple guests a week. Like, what's that process like? And how did you guys like vet potential guests? Because it just tied into what I said is there's some people that are very fact driven or research based, and there's other people that are just prone to the fantasy, or unfortunately there could be mental health issues. Like how did you go about like weeding, like who you're gonna, and obviously ideology is an easy one, but like for other things that could be more sticky, like how did you go about like kind of vetting that? And I'm sure there's probably some interesting stories you have with that, you know what I mean? That and vetting the vetting process.
So when we started doing Spooky South Coast, it was really easy. I mean, I just looked out to all of the people that I knew from the paranormal world and said, let's try to get them. So we were getting, Keith Johnson, Brad and Sherry Steiger, John Zaffis, trying to get all these people. But then we'd also find interesting websites and books and things. So, and we had, because we're on a real radio station, we had all of these publishing companies that were just sending us books left and right. So it became really easy to find guests, and we took it for granted because everybody that we had was so good and nobody was worrisome that we didn't have a problem. But then we had this guest that we booked. I think I heard her on Coast to Coast AM. and her name was, she went by the name Commander Sani Sido, and she claimed to be the reincarnated Roswell alien. The Roswell alien that died in the crash in 1947, reincarnated, and she had all the memories of that alien, and she was going to come on and talk about it all. And she was very combative with a lot of the questions that we asked. And her and Moniz got into it because Moniz is a scientist by trade. And so he was getting into it with her about how the math doesn't work on some of the things she was talking about. And they were going back and forth. And I don't know if he even knew what he was talking about, or if he was just trying to like goad her or what. I've never really gotten into that with him. But she got very upset. And I think she hung up on us. And that became like a moment for us to realize, like, okay, sometimes the guests might be full of it. And, you know, we've got to kind of find a balance with that. And as it came to find out, it turns out this person who claims to be Commander Sani Sido is on the spectrum and was prone to these delusions of grandeur and all kinds of things. So it was, you know, a lesson learned. We had another guy on who claimed to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. His name was Richard Brown. And so we brought him on for Christmas. You know, let's have Jesus on. Happy birthday, Jesus. Come on for Christmas.
Yeah.
And
it's a holiday.
Starts talking. Yeah, we're thinking, because I tried to get another guy who does a radio show called The Jesus Christ Show out in Chicago, where he plays Jesus Christ on the radio. And I said, let's get this guy. And he declined our offer. He said, listen, this works in the scope of my show in giving advice to people as Jesus, but I think if I did it on another show, it'd be blasphemous. I was like, totally understand. So I find this other guy, Richard Brown, and he comes on and starts talking to us all about how the world is going to end, and he's starting his own country, and everybody can be a part of it that sends him $6,000 or whatever it was. And we're like, well, what happens to the people that don't send you money? Well, I'm sorry, they're just not going to make it. And I was like, well, that's not very Jesus-like of you. And then I hung up the phone on him because I knew that at that point the guy was just a grifter.
Yeah.
And, you know, little things like that, lessons learned. But we were pretty lucky. When it came to doing Midnight Society, I was fortunate to have a great producer in Michelle Freed. She now produces Jimmy Church, Fade to Black. And she was working with Art Bell, and she worked with Heather Wade. So she was really good at finding guests and talking with them. And she asked me, like, what do you want me to stay away from? What do you want me to avoid? And I said to her, I was like, listen, I pride myself, and I can do a 2 or 3 hour interview with a paper bag, if that's what you give me. I can make anything work. And so she would actually try to find people that she knew would challenge me. And it worked out great for a long time because, I mean, Michelle, God love her, she's, and I don't think she'll mind me saying this, she's the sweetest, most trusting person in the world. So she never would think that somebody would have a hidden agenda to want to come on the show. And after a while, we started to get some that I could tell had the hidden agenda, and it got really hard. We were supposed to have on Dr. Judy Mikovits right around the time that COVID started. And she was going to come on. She was talking about COVID on different shows. So Michelle's like, I want to do a show on COVID. And I kept saying, it's too soon. It's too soon. This is February 2020. It's too soon. It's too soon. Let's wait a little bit. Let's wait a little bit. And then right when we finally booked her to come on, that was the week that the story broke about pandemic and how she didn't have these credentials and she was making stuff up to get attention and to make money. And so I just canceled the appearance. And I lost half my listenership because the Art Bell people were like, Art Bell never would have canceled her. Like, he would have had her come on and he would have challenged her. And I said, well, listen, I'm not a doctor. I don't know if what she's telling is the truth. I can't challenge her on that. And then the other part of that, too, is Art Bell wouldn't have had her on if he knew that she might be bringing misinformation to the radio. He would never allow that. So that's when I just made the line in the sand. And I said, I have a responsibility, and I have what I feel to be a job to do here. And I'm not going to bring people on that are going to, and, you know, some people still snuck in, and there'd still be the occasional people that would come in with an agenda, and we would just kind of weed it out. And sometimes you have to end the conversation early. We did have one guy. Do you want to hear the story about the time I almost killed the guest?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So this guy referred to himself as, what was his name? Mr. Black. I think that was his name. And so he was a UFO researcher, and he claimed to have all this information that nobody else had about UFOs. So we had him on, and this dude was just out there. He was just talking out of his ass with stuff that I was like, none of this is real. Like, you are just insane, and I am contributing to your insanity right now. But I also had a rule where it's not really my show, it's the guest show, and it's the listener show. And You know, I want them to present their story and let the guests decide if they want to believe them or not. That was what Art Bell would do. And so he's going on. And then finally, toward the end, I decided to push back and just challenge a little bit to some of the stuff that he was saying. And all of a sudden, he got all huffy and like was fighting with me and arguing. And then all of a sudden, the line just went dead. And I was like, hello? Hello? And so I don't, you know, I can't, I'm live on the air and I'm on KNYE in Pahrump, Art Bell Station. So I can't just stop the show and try to call this guy and get him back on. So I'm
it's not a podcast. Yeah, you can't hit pause. You know what I mean? It's a live broadcast. With a lot of listeners.
Vamping. I'm vamping while Michelle is like trying to get him back on the phone and he's not answering the phone. And so I was like, I don't know what's going on. Like what happened here? And so we joked afterwards. Like, I hope something didn't happen. Like, I hope me challenging him like didn't kill the guy.
Yeah.
Like, and because I'd always joke, I've never lost a guest yet. But like in this case, I started to get a little bit nervous because she called him for hours and hours afterwards and he never answered the phone. It's one thing if he gets mad and he hangs up. But you know, you think he would answer the phone with Michelle because Michelle had been working with him, getting him on other shows, and it turns out that he had a heart attack at that moment.
That's
and hung up the phone because he had to call the 911 to come and get him. And he ended up coming back with us on another appearance a little bit later on. But I said, you know, I've never killed the guest, but I came close now.
Yeah. That's crazy. Yeah, it is the thing, right? Because with the paranormal stuff, and I think me and you talked about this just one day, like outside, like when we were just like at the dip or something. Like, it's tough because you know you try and approach things with an open mind, and you got to hear people out, and it's like they're telling their story, and it's like you can have your own personal feelings, but it's like if you have them on your show, it's like, you know, how much do you challenge or how much do you you know, like obviously if they're there, like even some people, even if you don't fully believe it, it's you know, it's entertaining, you know what I mean? Because they'll have these wild stories, and it's and like at that point, at least it's entertaining. But it's like also I always approach it with like, oh, who am I to you know, I didn't live that, you know what I mean? So who am I to think they're lying? But some stuff just seems so, like you brought up Tony Rodriguez earlier, like his story seems so fantastic, and it touches on like every single element of like of paranormal and conspiracy that you're like, come on, man. But who knows? Because I don't know if like he's also just like a regular guy, you know what I mean? It's like who lives a regular life, so like his regular life isn't like, because we're like friends on Instagram and stuff, and it's just like he just posts a picture of him with his family or him hanging out riding a bike, you know, on a motorcycle or something, and it's like he's not like on the streets homeless, like because he's insane, you know what I mean? He's living a normal life, so it's like, you know, how much, you know, so it's kind of a weird world to traverse, like because obviously you'll have people on that are researchers and have more science stuff, but when you're dealing with the experiencers, sometimes you just got to take things at face value, I guess, and go with it and just listen to hear their story, and like you said, let the listener figure out if they want to agree with it or not, or believe it or not.
Right. My role, I always call myself the avatar for the audience. You know, I'm supposed to ask the questions that I think that they would ask in that moment. And it shouldn't be about my beliefs and what I believe. It should be about what I think the audience wants to know. But one of the things that I look for is when somebody's telling me their story, the things change. And I try to, I try not to listen to guests on some other show before I have them on my show, because I don't want to let whatever that conversation was influence my conversation. But sometimes with some guests, I have to. Tony was one that I did that for, where I listened to some other appearances to make sure that I knew what I was kind of dealing with. And Jim Wittenberger was another abductee that I had on, who I did 7 hours of radio with Jim Wittenberger over 2 appearances. And Jim Wittenberger has a tendency to repeat himself a lot, but he never wavers in the way that he tells that story. It's always the same little minute details from telling to telling. And when somebody's making something up, you can tell, because a lot of times they'll talk to a host and they'll see that host wasn't all that impressed with what they said. Like I'll tell you, oh, and that's when the aliens showed up in my bedroom, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, and that's when, and then they grab me, and then one of them rapes me, and they'll try to impress the host and try to make the host say, oh, wow. And so those details that they've never told in that story before all of a sudden pop up in that interview. And so I try to be careful when people do that kind of thing, because that's a telltale sign to me that they're just exaggerating and they're making it up as they go along. But when they're telling that same story over and over again, and all those little details never change, and none of your questions trip them up, then I believe that at least they believe what it is that they're saying.
Yeah. No, it's true. And it's tough, right? Do you listen too much? Like, I mean, I know you've been involved in this world for a long time. So does that keep you from listening to like other shows, like, other paranormal related shows or podcasts or things? Like, do you purposely avoid that so that you don't get that kind of cross contamination?
I did. So I listened to a lot of it in the early days. Like when the shows started popping up, I was listening to them all. I listened to Coast every night. I used to actually, I had a Sirius XM radio that was actually just XM at the time, but an XM radio that would record on a little like stored hard drive within the device. And I would record Coast to Coast every night and listen to it the next morning when I worked in a diner in the mornings. And so that's what I would do. And I listened to all the different podcasts that popped up, and I tried to absorb as much of it as I could. And then I started to realize like it was influencing what I was doing. But the same thing happened when I started working paranormal television. I stopped watching all the shows because I didn't want to let it influence the way that I was, coming up with things for the shows that I was working on. So I eventually had to just leave it all behind. Yeah. And thankfully now things have changed so much that I can listen to quote unquote paranormal content without it influencing me, because it's not a talk show where they're interviewing guests. Nobody's really doing that anymore, except people like yourself who are doing it in a way that I never would have been able to have done it on the radio because I was constrained by certain, factors being on public airwaves. But nowadays you get the storytellers, the people who are just as much into the mythology and the folklore as it is, whether or not things are true anymore. And so that's allowed me to kind of dive back into some of it and get into why I was interested in the first place, instead of just hearing everybody doing the same interview over and over.
Yeah. And it's going to be tough. Like for me, I sometimes have to listen to stuff just to kind of see who's out there and get ideas for people I might want to contact for guests. Cause like I said, I'm not on a radio station with where people are just sending me books and stuff. So I got to kind of seek it out. So it's like tough because I'll try, but I found myself doing like almost self-censorship, where if I'm listening to a podcast, cause that's what I listen to when I'm driving around. And I hear someone interesting, I'll like make a note and I'll stop the podcast and be like, this is someone I might want to talk to. And then, but I try not to listen to the whole podcast because I don't want to, for the exact same reason you had mentioned, I don't want it to influence what I do. But yeah, it's tough because it's in the there's so much now that it's like, I'm sure I don't know. I'm sure like 20 years ago, the world was probably smaller in some regards to the paranormal, but it seems like with podcasts and stuff, like it's just exploding and it's crazy and it's like everywhere. And I also think maybe because we live in such weird times, people are looking for an escape, so they get into more paranormal realms than dealing with reality. I don't know, but it just seems like there's a lot more out there,
And the pandemic obviously led to a big explosion in it, because a lot of people just sitting around at home were consuming content, and that led to a lot of people starting to create more content. So now, there's a lot of good quality shows out there where people are just doing it themselves. They're doing it on StreamYard. They're doing it, on Zoom, on Skype. They're doing it in ways, and now the equipment, you can build a studio in your house instead of having. Back in the the days when we were doing it and people started to build their own shows, they were doing it over something called Blog Talk Radio, which was a website where you could call in on a telephone. They would patch you through, and the producer would record your show. You could be live, you could be recorded, but you were basically, all you needed to do to do a show was talking on the telephone, and it sounded like crap. And we used to always say to people, hey, just because you can do a radio show doesn't mean you should do a radio show.
Sure, yeah.
But nowadays, things have changed, and people have become more polished, have become more professional, and you get something where it could just be somebody going Facebook Live, but it's even more entertaining than some of the stuff that you hear on regular radio, and you don't have the constraints of regular radio. So like being on WBSM, I couldn't have somebody on talk about alternative health, alternative healing, because the FCC regulates those airwaves. So you can only talk about things that are FCC approved. That are FDA approved. And then another problem is like, if we want to talk about hypnosis, we could never, like one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to have our friend Alan Alves from the Bridgewater Triangle, the Freetown cult cop who investigated all those cases, he became a hypnosis center owner, and he does hypnosis. And I want to have him hypnotize me on the radio. And he's like, I can't. Like, what do you mean you can't? Because if I do this on the radio, if anybody's listening becomes hypnotized and say they're driving and they crash their car, we're responsible. So I'm legally not allowed to do hypnosis on the radio. And I was like, I had no idea. So all these little things like that, these constraints are gone for people that are just doing shows based on the internet. And so the topics become wider, the approach to the topics become wider, and the viewpoints become wider.
Yeah. It's interesting. I don't think I'd want him to do, it'd be interesting to have him hypnotize someone on a podcast too. But if it does put somebody else under while they're just listening and driving around, then yeah, I think you could do it in a way where you have them do whatever it takes to get someone in that state, maybe off camera, you know what I mean, or off mic, mm-hmm. and then go from there, you know what I mean, like once they're already under. But yeah, I wouldn't want that liability either, even with the podcast, even though there's no one regulating that. But that's wild, and it's definitely something to think about. But I think the other thing too, though, is with it, there's so many podcasts now, and I forget how many. I saw statistics like there's like 900 million or something. It's wild. There's a wild number of podcasts, obviously covering all topics. And it's, how many actually survive, but there is so much paranormal content out there. It's hard to keep up with. And, but like you said, like the cream rises to the top, and there's a lot of like really good premium stuff out there. So it's an awesome time for media. Maybe not for the mainstream media, but for independent media. Like this is, you can buy $800 worth of equipment and sound like, what a radio station sounded like, 10 years ago, 15 years ago now. Like, like you don't need, insane amount of money to make a good quality product anymore. You just got to have the drive and the will and skill to do it. I guess it's out there, and it's interesting times, and it makes it's good. I like that there's so much out there. It just makes it harder to navigate, and I don't know how people find stuff like anymore because everything's so all over the place, but that's neither here nor there. Let's talk about, you brought up Alan Alves, you brought up Bridgewater Triangle stuff, Freetown Forest, where I'm right in the edge of the Freetown Forest right now as we talk. You've done a lot of research in the Bridgewater Triangle. And I know that's a topic that I've covered on the show. I've had like Chris Pittman on and other people, and we brought that up. And people love it. And we're from Massachusetts, and we're in it. So it's something we can relate to. So why don't you talk a little bit about some of the work you've done in Bridgewater Triangle and some of the research you've done in interesting things that you've encountered or experienced or heard about in your research in the Bridgewater Triangle?
Well, for us, it started pretty much right when we started researching stuff. So it was September, October of 2005 that we got the call, that I got the call that I could have my own radio show and that I pitched Spooky South Coast. So we spent the remainder of 2005 kind of building up topics so that we would have shows when we came out of the gate, have guests booked, and we wouldn't be doing it week to week, which didn't last very long. We always booked by the seat of our pants for most of the 18 years we've done it. But we started looking at different topics that we wanted to cover, and Matt Costa, who helped create the show with me, he said to me, so what do you think about talking about this Bridgewater Triangle? Have you ever heard of that? And I said, no, I haven't heard of it. And so he gave me Chris Balzano's Massachusetts Paranormal Crossroads website. And he gave me the site that Chris Pittman was running. And he said, read these and see what, and so that's when I started really looking into it. And I said, well, this is something we definitely should talk about because it's in our backyard. And I was able to meet those guys. I was able to, form a lifelong now friendship with Chris Balzano, one of my best friends, partner in a lot of things. We wrote a book together. And then Aaron Cadieux, who directed the Bridgewater Triangle documentary, he had this student film that he made called Inside the Bridgewater Triangle. And he gave us a DVD of it. And we watched that, and that was kind of our basis for getting a lot of this info. And we had him come on the show too. And I said, more people need to see this. You need to release this. And he said, well, I can't, because I just made it for a student film, so I used licensed music in it. So I can't release it commercially. And I was like, well, can you go back and take the music out? And he's like, I don't have the original masters of everything, so like I can't do that. And so he always had in his mind that he wanted to make a feature-length version of it someday. Well, along comes something called Google Video, which was the precursor to YouTube. And I said, well, you can't load it up to that, but I can. So I uploaded it to Google Video, and people started watching it, and it kind of started to take off from there. And we did a show every year where we did our Bridgewater Triangle investigation show. So once a year, we would send teams out into the triangle, and they would call in live with whatever was going on during the investigation. 90% of the time, nothing happened while they were out there during the show, but every once in a while, something would. And so it made for really fascinating radio because you never knew what was going to happen. And so that's when we started just making the triangle a regular topic on the show all the time. And for me, I honed in on the ghost side of it because that's what my preference is: ghosts and legends and lore. That's what I'm interested in. But you start to realize that there's so much going on. I mean, I've had UFO experiences in the Bridgewater Triangle. I've had, weird experiences of creatures that are out there that I can't explain in the Bridgewater Triangle. And I've also had to expand what I think the Bridgewater Triangle is. So, as I said in my presentation of the Dipper, it started off as, Bridgewater, West Bridgewater, East Bridgewater. But now I think it's Rhode Island. It's lower New Hampshire. It's all the way up to Cape Cod. I mean, it's a huge thing, and it's alive, and it's growing. And so every time we talk about the Bridgewater Triangle, we're creating another opportunity for the triangle to feed off of that energy.
Yeah. And like, what is your, like, with these areas, like, people talk about Bridgewater Triangle, Bermuda Triangle, there's places all over the country that are, like, for lack of a better word, hotspots for kind of paranormal activity. What do you think makes those spaces so paranormally charged? Like, some people think, oh, it's like a thinner, veil between this and other dimensions, or things like that. What is your impression based on, your thoughts and research that, what makes these places so paranormally active? And like,
I
what
subscribe to
might this be growing,
I subscribe to John Keel's theory that these are window areas. That was the term that he used for these vortexes. He called them window areas because it was giving us a window that allowed things to come in from somewhere else, and that maybe we could travel through from our existence. But I think that a window makes it sound like it's a finite thing. Like you've got these dimensions, you've got these borders to it. And I think in Keel's time and the research that he did, that made sense because there was not this proliferation of the paranormal like there is now. But now, I mean, you saw what happened at the Dipper. I used to do a presentation for 50 or 100 people, and I'd say, how many people have heard of the Bridgewater Triangle? And maybe 3 or 4 hands would go up. Now I have to say, who hasn't heard of the Bridgewater Triangle?
Yeah.
And most of the time, no hands go up at all.
Yeah.
So it's become a thing where, as we fed into it, we started to make connections that these experiences that we've had might be connected to this. And it allows for us to redefine what we thought that triangle was. So I don't know if it's so much that it's actually growing as much as it maybe the entire world is one big window area, and we're just peeling off the tape that we put over it to keep us from seeing through it.
Yeah. And so, you started mentioning some things that you've encountered there, like whether it's your personal experiences or experiences when you sent teams out on the radio. What were some of the things that were encountered? What was some of the paranormal activity that you guys encountered out there?
I think, a lot of times when we send teams out there, they would get shadow people, they would get mysterious lights. One of our earliest Bridgewater Triangle episodes, we had a team out at Anawan Rock, and they picked up, which is the site where Anawan was captured by the English during King Philip's War. And you will hear like Native American voices saying "Iutash, Iutash," which is believed to mean stand and fight. And people will report phantom campfires. And that happened while the team was out there. They heard those voices. They smelled phantom campfires. I think they saw glimpses of campfires out in the woods. So it becomes, a story of, or a question of, is it that they are actually experiencing these things because they're out there, or has the legend and the story become part of, what we experience now? And to me, that's just as fascinating as anything else. I think it's cooler in my mind if we're actually making the legends come to life than it is if there's actually just this paranormal activity that's happening alongside of us. So with
Yeah,
that in
it's
mind,
like
I've
that would
always
show some like untapped human power, human potential to manifest this stuff, right? Versus this stuff
which
is here.
which I think is more beneficial to mankind. You know, I
Yeah.
don't care what happens to me when I die, so I don't care if there's going to be life after death. So I don't really get hung up on it. But
Mm.
I like to think about what can we as humans do in the time that we have here, and the expansion of consciousness is far more interesting to me than that. So I like to lean into those kind of things. But I've also had things that have happened to me that I'm like, well, how did that come out of my consciousness? I didn't
Mm.
imagine, these lights in the sky. I don't want to see a UFO. I don't want to experience aliens.
Yeah.
So for me, I see some of that as being like, okay, some of this we can generate, but some of this isn't intelligence beyond our own.
Yeah. I've had other people on, like a guy Phil, who's a researcher and stuff, and same thing, the phantom campfires, a lot of times people report hearing drums, like Native American drums and stuff,
Mhm.
um, and spirits speaking in old languages, or Indian languages and things like that. Um, yeah, and it is an interesting question. Is it something that we're just manifesting because we think that's what we're supposed to hear when we go out there, or is it, or not what we're supposed to, but that's something that could happen, or is it just something from the past, that's still lingering? Um, what is your thought? I know you've done a lot of research on ghosts. Like, what are your thoughts on what ghosts are? Like, are they like a sentient apparition? Are they something coming through from another dimension that isn't taking a physical form, or is it just something stuck in time, and just stuck on repeat? Like, I know, and it could be any of those things or all those things, but you've done a lot of work in this area. What is your kind of sense on what quote unquote a ghost is?
Well, it may sound like a cop out, but I think it is all of the above. I
Yeah.
think most of the ghosts that we encounter, especially doing paranormal research and going to haunted locations and visit them and investigating, a lot of what we encounter is stuff that we've created. And when I say that, I don't want people to think that I mean it's not real, that it's in our minds, that it's in our imagination. We've actually put out the energy to make this happen.
Mm.
So if you look at a place, I always use the Lizzie Borden house as an example. It's a place where murders happen, and then for a long time it was a private residence, and nobody that lived in that private residence reported any paranormal activity. But then when it opened up as a bed and breakfast in 1996, and everybody was coming in talking about the murders every day, all of a sudden it became one of the most haunted places in the world. Is that because ghosts were hiding out and waiting for their moment? Or is that because enough people went there saying, gee, if any place would be haunted, it's this place? And so they gave it the energy to kind of become haunted. So I think that's a big factor in a lot of it.
Mm.
I often struggle with, is there life after death? And is that what a ghost is? Because I don't see a lot of that in my research per se.
Yeah.
I see things where it could be, more something that we've manifested, or more something that could be some other intelligence that's just playing with us. But then I have an experience that kind of humbles me and brings me back to it, like the time that I shook hands with a shadow person, or the time, just just a couple weeks ago, I was investigating at the Weymouth Teen Center, which is a former police station. But when it became a teen center, they had this kid who was an artist who drew a mural there, and he ended up passing away. And he is said to haunt the place and to still be around the place. And he's coming through, and he's telling us things on the Estes method. And he actually drew on the window for us. He drew a smiley face. He drew a heart. I mean, there's something there. That's not me doing that. I couldn't have done that if I tried. And then in that same investigation, that same night, doing the Estes method in another part of the building, my grandmother came through. And for my grandmother died in 1998, and I've, all the time that I've been doing this, I've wanted her to come back and come through, and she never has, save for one dream that she came to me in, and gave me like a little bit of much needed prophetic information that I needed for basically my ex-wife was pregnant with our son, and she had gestational diabetes, and we were afraid he was going to have diabetes when he came out, and we were very concerned. And my grandmother came to me in a dream, and she told me he was going to be okay, and she told me some other things that turned out 20 years later to be dead on.
Wow.
But all of that stuff, wrapped up, I got the chance to ask the spirit, like, Grandma, was that you in my dream? Was that really you? And she told me that it was. And, normally I'm the kind of person that doesn't believe that it's somebody's relative, but she's giving me information and telling me things that only she would know. And I said, well, if that was you in the dream, what's one thing about the dream that I'll know that it was you? And she said, coffee, which was a big part of the dream. I walked in and she was sitting in a place where she sat every day and just drank coffee, sat down, told me to get a cup of coffee and sit with her and have a coffee. So, little things like that make me think, okay, maybe there is something to this life after death aspect. And then another part of it is exactly what you were talking about before. It's residual energy. It's time slips. It's when you go to a place and they say, oh, there's a Civil War soldier who walks through the house every night at midnight. Okay, and then you go there at midnight and you see the Civil War soldier walk through, because it is just energy that's repeating and replaying, and it can't interact with you. It doesn't know you're there, but it's just there repeating itself. So I think that all those factors have been happening for a long, long time, and we've tried to put ghosts in a hard set definition so that we can eliminate some of those, when really it's all of the above.
Yeah. Shaking hands with a shadow person. Yeah, I got to hear that story. And what did, like, when? Yeah, I just want to I got to hear that story. Then
I thought I wasn't going to let that slip by you there. So we investigated the Houghton Mansion out in North Adams, and this was a place that a lot of paranormal teams had gone through. It had been on the TV shows. It was being run by a couple of paranormal investigators, and this was a place that was the A.C. Houghton. That was A.C. Houghton, the first mayor of North Adams. He had built this house, this mansion. He lived in it. There was an accident. His daughter had died, and some other people had died. His driver, who was driving the car in this car accident, he ended up killing himself because of the guilt that he had. And A.C. Houghton eventually died of a broken heart, or maybe of internal injuries, as my friend Jeff Belanger likes to point out. But all this stuff goes on. And then the Freemasons come in and they buy the mansion, and they turn it into a Masonic lodge. So this mansion was like a U-shaped giant building. And in that middle of the U, they built their Masonic lodge. So we were in there investigating, and full disclosure, most of my investigations are events that we do as fundraisers for people to buy a ticket and experience the paranormal, but then also it raises money for these historic places. So we're doing this event, and we're in the lodge in the secret area where they used to do special rituals, and all night long we saw shadow people walking back and forth down this hallway. They'd be, you and I would be standing there across from each other in the hallway, and the shadow people would be walking between us. And if you said something, they'd turn to look at you. I mean, these were three-dimensional human shapes.
But also, they were interacting. If you called them, they looked. That's how do you not? How do you, like, at that point, like, is like your heart racing when you're like, hey, and it turns and looks at you like what's going through your head at that point? That's because sometimes you hear about them, but you don't hear about them that interactive all the time.
All I'm thinking to myself is, don't do anything to scare them away. Like, just be there and observe and be in the moment, and try not to make it weird for them. And so they continued on with what they were doing. Later on, toward the end of the night, there was one shadow person that was way in the back of this area, and he was kind of like watching us. And we could see him like poke his head out from the wall, and we were trying to coax him to come down to where we are at the other end of the room. And he walks down, and we get to the point where he's maybe like 6 feet from us. And we can see, like, there's this three-dimensional human shape standing there, darker than the darkness behind it. And I say, hey, can you give me a fist bump? And I put my hand out, because I'm thinking to myself, that's like the lightest way of touching. So I was like, give me a fist bump. And this guy, Frank, that was investigating with me, elbows me in the gut, and he says, don't give him a fist bump, but shake his hand like a man. So I put my hand out, and I say, can you shake my hand? And I felt his hand wrap around mine and envelop my hand, and it felt just like a human being's hand. And then he started pumping my arm up and down. I went limp so that, like, I wasn't influencing anything. And I felt him pump my arm up and down in a handshake motion, and I just started crying. Like, to me, it was like I just had an actual encounter with something that is real, that really does exist, that has its own intelligence, and it changed who I was. Before that, I was kind of like, going into a place like, all right, come on, ghost, show me who you are. I don't have a lot of time to spend here, so, perform for me, dance, monkey.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then this kind of changed my perspective of being like, for lack of a better term, the cliche is ghosts were people too. And so then I
yeah.
started treating them a lot differently.
So yeah, and I've had a couple people on that have talked about shadow people and have had different encounters. Some more, were on the, were more on the not as benevolent, like a little bit more terrifying for people. Um what now with shadow people, like what is your kind of thoughts about what they are? Is it a ghost in the traditional sense? Is it something else? And like when it was shaking your hand, this is just a physical, it felt just like a normal human hand? Did it feel cold? Did it give you any other kind of, was it a different sensation? Like what did, like physically, what did that feel like? Or did it just feel like shaking someone's hand?
It felt just like shaking another human being's hand, except for it didn't have that feeling of it. It didn't have the tactile feeling. Like when you're shaking somebody's hand, you can feel their hand, you can feel the palm, you can feel like how rough their skin is.
Yeah.
You can feel if they're clammy or sweaty. It didn't have that feel to it, so it was more like the you know like the weight of it and the borders of it without having that same force behind it.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Um, and because the last thing I would have wanted in that situation was to have something that would have made me want to retract my hand away.
Yeah.
And so it felt very warm and inviting. It was tingly. It felt a little bit tingly, but it felt human without feeling imposing.
Wow.
And all my shadow people experiences that I've had after that, and I've had a lot, I very rarely have encountered anything that I thought was negative. It's always
Yeah.
been positive, with the exception of one time, a thing in the Lizzie Borden basement, which I thought was, this negative entity that lives in that house and has gone after me for years. But I think that they've all been maybe ghosts that couldn't quite manifest into an apparition. So this was the easiest way for them to appear. That's what I feel most of the encounters that I've had are. And sometimes, they will just hang back. Sometimes they'll come right up and get in our faces. But that's basically what I've always felt that they were.
Yeah. And so you've encountered them enough now where it's almost not, I'm not trying to put words in, like, a thought on you, but it's almost like not kind of normalized for you, right? Like you're used to seeing them now. Like that's a that's wild.
I am. I'm definitely used to it, especially a place like the Oliver House in Middleborough. I
Yeah.
will, like, the first thing I do when I start the investigation is go down to the basement, interact with the shadow people, say hi. Usually most investigations I start in the basement because I figure that's the heart of the house, and that's where I can have some shadow activity because it's the darkest place. And I
Yeah.
just introduce myself, and more often than not, I have those experiences.
Yeah. It's wild, man. And it's weird how, people have different experiences with these things. And is it just their own fear getting in the way? Like, cause you see this black mass coming at you, so you automatically think it's something negative. So you respond to it out of fear. Whereas if you just kind of like hung out there for a second, that you might have seen that the thing wasn't being malevolent. Like, um, yeah, it's interesting to think about. Like, uh, I have never encountered any, the only thing I've ever encountered, like, paranormal is orbs, dancing in front of my window at like 3 in the morning when I was driving home one night, in Freetown. Minor things like that. So I haven't been on any active like investigations or things like that. But I don't know, uh, is that something you've seen, like where if people kind of just get over like the initial like fear that you some of these things aren't really like negative or evil or anything, they're just there?
I've had people who have run out screaming when they first encounter them.
Yeah.
Sometimes I've been able to coax them to come back down. Sometimes they get in the car and go home.
Yeah, yeah.
And I always tell them the same thing, like, you signed a waiver, no refunds,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
for the most
You can't
part,
sue me. Yeah, yeah.
for the most part, those people, they are unnerved by it. But
Yeah,
once you realize that they're not going to do anything to you, and really, what can they do to you? They can't even manifest.
yeah,
So they're
yeah.
not going to do anything to you that's going to, harm you in any physical way. So then you start to open yourself up to it, and then you realize, like, okay, this is a person, or at least it's something trying to be a person. So I'm just going to treat it like a person, and then it changes your perspective.
Yeah. Have you, and I think you touched on this, but have you, in your years, of investigating, have you experienced any, like, I know you talked about, like, when you were a kid, you the thing in your grandmother's house, but outside of that, have you experienced any kind of, like, negative or terrifying things? Or has it been more just kinda like looking at it like how you have talked about?
So I've had just a couple of experiences where I've ever really been scared.
Yeah.
Um, One is so I do deal with something malevolent at the Lizzie Borden. I think that there's an elemental that lives in the basement of that home that fed on the negativity of the Borden family, that maybe influenced the murders, and certainly lives there now and kind of snacks on all the people coming and talking about that. It loves the bad energy, and it's reached out to me at other places before. So I'll be doing an investigation somewhere else, and it'll start talking to me through like Echo Box or something, and I have to tell it, "You don't belong here. Go away." So
Mm.
that's one thing. It doesn't really scare me, but it's the one thing that I'm careful of. The
Now,
two times
oh,
that I've been afraid. Sorry.
just one for people that might not have heard the term before, like, when you said it's an elemental, what makes what is an elemental?
An elemental is something that is a spirit, an entity that was never human. So
Okay.
it's something that's been around for a long time, probably as old as the earth itself, and
Yeah.
it will act like a ghost. It can do things for a person. A lot of people refer to them as demons. That
Yeah.
might be a term that people would use for them if they're putting a theological twist on it. But I just think they're these things that have always been there. They can be positive, they can be negative. Sometimes they're
Yep.
really good. Sometimes you have places that are full of positive energy. It's from positive elementals, but most of them are negative just because they've been around for so long. They know that people suck, and so
Yeah.
why give them any credence?
Sure.
But the the two times that I was afraid, one was at Fort Tabor in New Bedford.
Yep.
We were in Battery Milliken, which we had permission to be in. We were doing an event as a fundraiser for the military museum, and we had heard from a medium who had gone into this area of Battery Milliken before we went in that there was a young boy's ghost in this area that we were going to go to who was crouching down and he had his hand over his head and it looked like he was crying or something. He was upset. And she said, go try to talk to him and see if you can figure out why he's upset. So we went down there. Now, keep in mind, Battery Milliken is dug out of a tunnel. So you're
Yeah.
underground when you're in this tunnel. And we get into the very middle, the dead center of this thing. And we can feel a breeze hitting us in the face. And there's no way a breeze should be coming into this underground tunnel and have to turn around all these corners to get to where we are. So we say, maybe there's something here. And I go to put my millimeter down so I can start to take temperature readings and everything. And I feel it get colder. And then it looks like you're, all right, there we go. I thought it froze up on me. And so then, which would just be typical ghosts. But we feel this cold air coming. So all of a sudden, we're like, all right, something's here. And then it sounded like the roof was caving in on us. And we thought we were dead because we've got all of this, ground over us that we're worried about is going to crash through and bury
Sure.
us.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And when we look up, there's nothing there. Nothing had changed. Nothing moved. And it took us a little while to figure out, but this battery was where they used to have the cannons that they fired them one time from Fort Tabor out toward the harbor. And it was so loud that it reverberated and shook everybody's houses. And they heard it all the way on Martha's Vineyard. And the people who lived around the fort said, please don't ever do that again. You broke every dish and window in our houses. So we think what happened was we caught phantom cannon fire. And what that little boy was doing when he was ducking down, it wasn't that he was scared or in trouble or yelled at or anything. He knew there was a fire in the hole. So he was ducking and covering
Yeah.
because he knew the
He was just protected himself. Yeah.
So I thought I was going to die, though. So that's why I was scared. And then the other time I was scared was we were doing an investigation of the S.K. Pierce mansion out in Gardner. And this place had a lot of negative history. And my friend Christy had a spirit attach itself to her the last time we were there because we used the Ouija board when my friend Stephanie, who's a psychic medium, Stephanie Burke, told me not to use the Ouija board. And I didn't listen, and we did it anyway. And this thing attached itself to Christy. And it took Stephanie weeks to get this thing detached from her. So we were going back for the first time, and it was years later. And I asked Stephanie, what was the name of that spirit that attached itself to Christy? And she said, I'm not telling you. was like, no, tell me, I want to know. She's like, no, because you're going to try to contact it. And I was like, no, I won't. And I texted Christy and I said, wait, what was that spirit? And so hours later, we're in this room and we were trying to communicate with whoever was there. And my text gets returned from Christy with the name. And so I said to everybody in the room, do you want me to try to contact the spirit? And they said, yeah, do it. And so I looked and the text said Laura. And so I said, Laura, are you here with us? And as soon as I said that, the door to the room slammed. Every device in the room went off full blast. And Echo Box just started saying Laura, Laura, Laura over and over again. And it was the only time I ever felt like I was in a horror movie. So then go home. Stephanie drops me off after I told her what had happened. She calls me an idiot for not listening to her. And she says, before you go into the house, do me a favor, say a protection prayer. And I said, I don't believe in all that stuff. And she's like, just do it to humor me. So I said, okay, fine. Nothing can follow me in the house, whatever, I'm protected. And so I get out of the car and I go and I walk in and I go over the threshold into the living room. And in my backpack, my REM pod starts going off, which is a high-pitched shriek anytime that there's a spike in EMF activity. And so at the time I'm married, my son's he's asleep, my wife's asleep. So I'm like, oh my God, this is going to wake everybody up. So I rip open my backpack and I'm like, I always take the battery out. Why did I leave the battery in it? And then when I look, I had taken the battery out of it. There was no battery in this REM pod and it was going off. So I think it was that spirit trying to say, I'll follow you in here if I want to follow you.
Yeah, that's wild. I know you said typical of ghosts with something, but like with interference. But when you did bring up elemental stuff, you did start glitching out a lot, which is
I
whatever.
thought you were glitching, so it turns out it was me glitching. It probably was something else.
Yeah. So yeah, man. You've had a long history with this stuff. I'm gonna have to run soon. Is there any other like big kind of standout stories or anything you wanted to cover today? And obviously down the road we can do other more pointed episodes if you wanted to come back on. You always have an open invite. But is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think's important? I know we talked a little bit about Bridgewater Triangle ghost stuff, things, but anything else or any other standout kind of experiences or anything else you wanted to touch on?
My one big thing, and the thing that I want everybody that looks into the paranormal to come away from, well, two things. One is it's really about, like we said before, asking the right questions, being open to things, certainly be skeptical, but also don't be dismissive. Just because something might change your perspective, you can't be afraid of that. You can't be afraid to have your whole worldview change, because it's happened to me many times over. So that's one thing that I'm a real big advocate of. The other thing is, we have a saying in all the events that we do. We say, come for the ghosts, stay for the history. All these places that we're talking about, they have a history to them. And certainly here in, the Bridgewater Triangle where we live and in New England, we have a really deep ghostly, but also, beyond ghostly history. And I don't ever want people to lose that. And this is the way, because I've been doing this for now 20 years, just about. And when I started, every historical society was made up of people in their 70s, their 80s, even into their 90s, who were dying off with no younger generation interested in history looking to take it over. And through the paranormal, the ones that were smart enough to embrace the fact that there might be hauntings in some of the buildings that they owned and things like that, we were able to get this whole new generation of younger people that want to keep the history alive, that become part of the historical societies, who volunteer their time. And that's really what's going to keep this history going and keep giving us access to these places. So I don't ever want people to lose the history aspect of it, and, push the boundaries, but never forget the people that came before you and did this work. Because, I'll do, as you saw, I'll do a presentation and I'll talk about everybody that I learned from and everybody that I picked up information from. And I'll go all the way back to, Pliny the Younger writing about ghosts back in ancient Greece, because it's been around us for as long as we've, had human history, and we can't be dismissive of that. Ghosts are real. The paranormal is real. We just still haven't figured out how to explain it. And it's because we're just trying to explain it in the wrong way and we're not asking the right questions.
Sure. A couple of quick questions. Follow up. Earlier when we were talking about, human potential and human, the ability to manifest things and You were talking about expanding consciousness and stuff. Quick question, and feel free to answer or not, because the public, public. This is in the public, but have you ever experimented with any kind of psychedelics like DMT or mushrooms, and did that do anything? Like, did you encounter any entities when you did that? If you did.
So I never have, because I'm kind of a lame-o. And also, I've heard that you need a lot of time to dedicate to those things.
Yeah.
That you could be like out for a day or two, and I don't really have time to spend with all the stuff that I do. But I've actually wanted to. I mean, I've talked about DMT, I've talked about mushrooms, just to see what that experience would be like, and to see if it would change things. So I haven't done it yet, but I wouldn't say that I'm opposed to maybe doing it somewhere down.
Sure, because I'm wondering, like, because people do talk about having paranormal type encounters with entities when they're in those states. Now, mushrooms, you need like 5-6 hours, 4 to 6 hours. DMT, you need 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So that might be the route. If you do decide to explore, that might be the way to go for you. The other thing is, we kind of talked about this. Well, actually, before I get into that one, because that might be a bigger question, but we've talked about ghosts and UFOs and things like that. Have you ever had any personal experiences or experiences like through your teams, like when you're doing the radio show? Has anyone, have you or anyone had any experience in the triangle or beyond with the things that would be called like cryptids, whether it's like a puckwudgie or a dogman or Sasquatch or something like that? Have you had any experiences with that?
I don't think I've had too many cryptid experiences. There was a time that we climbed to the top of Profile Rock, and we saw before it got destroyed, and we saw a big, large shit like on an outcropping that didn't look like a dog shit. So it's like, well, either a human being somehow found a way to, and it looked like there's no way a normal human could have put themselves out there, and squatted and done this. So I was like, maybe that was a Bigfoot. We deemed it the paranormal poop, and it became a thing on the radio for quite a long time.
Yeah.
That's probably my closest.
You should have tried to get a sample and sent it to the lab. You would have been the guy with the watch turd. Yeah.
So Moniz actually thought about it because he was working in a lab and he had access to testing things, and he was like, but even he had trouble trying to reach out to where it was, and also we didn't really have the best kind of things to collect the sample. So,
yeah, sure. Yeah.
You don't want to. The next time we went there, it was gone.
Yeah. All right. And when this might be kind of a not even a question, but it just a sense like and I don't even know what the question is here, but it's just something that like blew my mind when I started getting into this world. And I think some of my guests like Chris Pittman and Matt, I'm just blanking out on his last name. He wrote a book called Initiated, where they were talking about UFO experiences or alien experiences, but they reframed it under the term of like a non-human intelligence because it was interactive and these intelligences like actively screwed around with these guys and like screwed around with them and with people in their lives. What's your sense when like, I don't even know what the question is here, so I'm sorry I'm stumbling, but I don't know if you're familiar with Chris's I know you know Chris, but like with Chris's story, have you heard his whole story with like how like they were screwing around with his girl, his ex at work and stuff like that? Like, what is your sense that is? Do you think that's like something more, like you said, more elemental, or do you or is that something more, extraterrestrial? And would extraterrestrial even really bother with that? You know what I mean? Like, what's the end game with that type of stuff? Like, like messing around with people and
stories like Chris's are part of the reason why I think that these are not, EBEs. They're not extraterrestrial biological entities. These are things that are created or existing on Earth in some fashion. And so I think that that's what they need, and that's what they thrive on, that's what they feed off of, is those human interactions. And part of the problem is we're not as afraid of them as we used to be. I mean, if you hear people talking all the time who say, I get abducted all the time, they're my alien brothers and sisters, I love them. And
my space brothers,
right. I don't think that's not feeding the need that these entities have. So what it's doing is it's creating this, okay, fine, like we can learn from these people and learn more about how the humans tick, even though these ones like us and aren't scared of us. And then we can apply that to the people who we can really freak out. And so
Yeah.
somebody like Chris Pittman, who it took a lot to shake him up.
Yeah.
You need to push that. And so that's why I think you get a lot of this. Moniz is somebody who I should definitely have him on, because he's dealt with abductees for a long time, and his specialty is people who didn't know each other before, met on the ship, and then then meet again in life because the aliens are pushing, or whatever these beings are pushing them to be together for whatever purpose. And he's had that experience himself. So he will tell you that there is an end game to some of this, that there is a method to the madness, and that they are manipulating people for a reason. I don't see it.
Yeah. And it's like, that was kind of my question, is like, if they're doing this, like, what is the end game? Like, and that's probably obviously an unanswerable question, but it's just something to ponder and for people to ponder. And do you think that they feed off of like human fear, I guess? Like, is like, we're manifesting it, and is it they need that to feed off of? Like, they need that to continue, whatever, like they need that to exist. I don't know.
So if there's the possibility that ghosts and aliens are kind of the same ilk, then I think it's absolutely, possible that they feed off of our fear, because we know that ghosts feed off of our energy. The energy that we give off helps the ghosts manifest, and maybe aliens are the same way. And what's the most powerful type of energy that we give off? It's fear energy. There's no energy that we give off that's more palpable and more powerful than fear energy. And so that's why I think that both ghosts and aliens would have a reason to scare us. If they're trying to get our energy and feed off of that, they have a reason to keep us afraid, and that fear energy is what's feeding them. So yeah, I mean, we could probably, if we all just accepted they were real and dealt with it, they'd probably find a different way to get that energy to manifest. But as long as people are afraid of them, they're going to keep making us afraid.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, man. It's super, I don't know, super interesting stuff. It's like, I'm still at that stage where it's so like wondrous to me that like, I know we're having this conversation live, but I'm like in my head thinking about things. So it's like, and ADD helps me fire in a million directions at once. So with that said, where can people find you, and what do you have coming up? Anything coming up where people could get involved? Or, I know you do a lot of events that, are like paranormal related activities, where hunting or investigations, where the end game is that it also gives back to the community, or to the historical building and whatnot, which is a very noble cause, right? Like that you're giving back, and not just pocketing the money. But yeah, you got anything coming up that people could get involved with? Or if not, at least give out your socials and stuff, like, so that people can find you and find what you got going on.
The best way to find me is at Tim Weisberg on Instagram, on Twitter. I'm Tim Weisberg 78 on TikTok, and I'm the other Tim Weisberg on Facebook. So it's facebook.com/the other Tim Weisberg. There's a guy that plays the flute, and he's more famous than me, so he beat me to it. But there's also the Spooky South Coast website. We'll put up different events that we'll be doing there. And in the fall, I'll be out at all different kinds of libraries and different places giving presentations. Of course, we'll definitely be back at the Dipper doing Pizza and the Paranormal. And then we're working on finalizing an event that we started doing last year called Spooky Sandwich, where, as much as I wish that it involved sandwiches to eat, it's actually Sandwich, Massachusetts. And last year we did a couple of historic places, including the school that I went to elementary school in, which was really cool. But this year we're going to be doing some different places that I can't quite say yet. But once we have it all finalized, we'll have an announcement.
Okay, so yeah, go to the Spooky South Coast to find out about upcoming events. Follow Tim on all his socials. He's there's so much going on, and definitely want to have you on again, and we can do more pointed conversations. I just wanted to do like a general one with you to kind of get people in my audience to know you a little bit. Yeah, man, I want to thank you for taking the time today to come on. Thank you again for coming out to the Dipper. It was such a good time. I screwed up and didn't have a second bartender, so I didn't get to see as much of it as I wanted because I was an extra bar back there helping out. But next time we will have the room set up a lot better. And but yeah, man, again, thank you for coming on. I'm going to shut the recorder off here, but I'm not going to hang up. So give me 1 second here.